The winter of 1944 descended upon central Germany with a brutality that seemed designed to punish the living. Snow fell in endless curtains across the Thuringian countryside, blanketing the forests and fields in white silence. In this frozen landscape, approximately 15 kilometers south of the town of Gotha, stood Stalag 9C, a prisoner of war camp that housed Allied soldiers captured during the grinding campaigns across Western Europe. The camp was a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, a place where men survived rather than lived, where hope was rationed more carefully than bread. Guards in Wehrmacht gray patrolled the perimeter, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, their rifles slung across shoulders stiff with cold. Inside the wire, prisoners huddled around improvised stoves, wearing whatever layers they could scavenge, counting days until a war's end that seemed impossibly distant. To the German guards and camp administrators who worked at Stalag 9C, Krankenschwester Anna Keller was a familiar and unwelcome presence. She arrived each morning precisely at 8 o'clock, walking through the main gate with the stiff posture of Prussian efficiency, her nurse's uniform immaculate despite the muddy conditions, her face set in an expression of permanent disapproval. The guards disliked her. She was cold, sharp-tongued, perpetually critical of their procedures. She treated the prisoners with visible contempt, handling them roughly during medical examinations, showing no sympathy for their complaints of illness or injury. When prisoners were loaded onto Red Cross trucks for transport to hospitals, she supervised with harsh efficiency, barking orders at orderlies, checking paperwork with obsessive attention to detail. To the prisoners themselves, Anna Keller was something worse than disliked. She was feared. They called her the nurse from hell in whispered conversations after lights out, sharing stories of her cruelty. She had struck sick men who moved too slowly. She had denied medical care to prisoners she deemed malingering. Her rounds through the camp infirmary were dreaded events where the sick and injured faced not comfort, but interrogation and abuse. But what no one knew, not the guards who avoided her, not the prisoners who feared her, not the camp commandant who approved her work orders, was that Krankenschwester Anna Keller did not exist. The woman who walked through those gates each morning, who wore the nurse's uniform and the expression of Germanic efficiency, was an invention, a character performed with such conviction that reality itself seemed to bend around the deception. Her real name was Marta Kowalska. She was 28 years old, born in Krakow to a family of physicians, educated at the Jagiellonian University Medical School before the war, transformed her from a student of healing into a courier for the Polish resistance. The woman the Germans knew as Anna Keller, the cruel nurse who treated prisoners like vermin, was in fact executing one of the most audacious rescue operations of the entire war. Every night, after the guards changed shifts and the camp settled into uneasy sleep, the nurse from hell worked by candlelight in the infirmary office. She forged medical records with a physician's knowledge of terminology and a forger's attention to detail. She swapped identification tags between prisoners, creating phantom patients whose documents would survive scrutiny. She loaded men designated as terminally ill onto Red Cross trucks that departed the camp bound not for German hospitals, but for safe houses operated by resistance networks that stretched across occupied Europe. Over 6 desperate weeks, in the winter of 1944, Marta Kowalska smuggled more than 300 Allied prisoners out of Stalag 9C, one stretcher at a time, one forged document at a time, one perfectly performed moment of cruel efficiency at a time. When the Gestapo finally uncovered her network through the interrogation of a captured resistance member, Marta was already gone, vanished into the underground networks that had created her false identity, leaving behind only her blood-stained nurse's cap on an empty bunk and a legend that would outlive the war itself. They called her a demon. History would remember her as salvation disguised in starched white linen. The story of how a Polish medical student became the nurse from hell begins not in the frozen confines of a German POW camp, but in the elegant streets of Krakow in the years before war consumed Europe. Marta Kowalska was born in 1916 to Dr. Stanislav Kowalski and his wife Helena, themselves the children of physicians, part of a family tradition of medicine that stretched back 3 generations. The Kowalski household on Ulica Kanonica, in the shadow of Wawel Castle, was filled with medical texts and anatomical drawings, with dinner table conversations about diagnoses and treatments, with a quiet understanding that healing was both profession and calling. Marta grew up in this atmosphere, absorbing medical knowledge the way other children absorb fairy tales. She was a brilliant student, intense and focused in a way that sometimes alarmed her teachers. While other girls her age attended dances and pursued social engagements, Marta spent evenings in her father's study, reading Gray's Anatomy and surgical textbooks, asking questions that revealed an intellect far beyond her years. In 1934, at 18, she entered the Jagiellonian University Medical School, one of only 7 women in her class. The male students resented her presence initially, viewing female medical students as curiosities rather than colleagues. Marta responded not with arguments, but with performance, consistently ranking at the top of her class, demonstrating surgical skills during practicals that impressed even skeptical professors. By 1939, Marta was in her 5th year of medical studies, preparing for examinations that would qualify her to begin hospital residency. She specialized in emergency medicine and trauma surgery, drawn to the immediacy and intensity of saving lives in critical moments. Her professors predicted a distinguished career, perhaps eventually a position at the university itself. Then, on September 1st, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. The world Marta had known, the future she had planned, ended in the thunder of artillery and the scream of Stuka dive bombers. The German occupation of Krakow began on September 6, 1939, when Wehrmacht forces entered the city without significant resistance. Within weeks, the systematic destruction of Polish intellectual and cultural life commenced. The Jagiellonian University, one of Europe's oldest and most prestigious institutions, became an immediate target. On November 6, 1939, German authorities invited university professors to a lecture on the Nazi attitude toward Polish education and science. It was a trap. 183 professors and academic staff who attended were arrested and deported to concentration camps. Marta's mentor, Professor Jan Nowak, a renowned surgeon who had encouraged her medical studies, was among them. He would die in Sachsenhausen concentration camp 4 months later. The university was closed. Medical education ceased. Marta found herself in an occupied city, her studies interrupted indefinitely, her professional future erased by military conquest. But the Kowalski family had resources beyond formal institutions. Dr. Stanislav Kowalski, Marta's father, had spent years building relationships with medical professionals across Poland and Europe. Within weeks of the occupation, he had established contact with the nascent resistance movement forming in Krakow's underground networks. Medical professionals were invaluable to the resistance. They could treat wounded fighters without reporting gunshot wounds to German authorities. They could forge medical exemptions from forced labor. They could provide access to hospitals and clinics where resistance members could hide. Dr. Kowalski offered his skills and his home to the cause. Marta, with her medical training and fluent German, learned during summers spent with relatives in Vienna before the war, became a natural recruit for resistance operations. Initially, her role was simple. She carried messages between resistance cells, her medical bag providing cover for documents hidden among bandages and instruments. But as the resistance grew more sophisticated, as networks expanded and operations became more complex, Marta's role evolved. Her medical knowledge, her language skills, her ability to maintain composure under pressure, all these qualities made her invaluable for increasingly dangerous assignments. By 1942, Marta Kowalska had become one of the most effective couriers in the Krakow resistance network, carrying intelligence across occupied Poland, coordinating between different resistance groups, establishing contacts with Allied intelligence operatives. She had learned to forge documents, to create false identities, to lie with such conviction that truth and deception became indistinguishable. She had also learned to kill. In the summer of 1943, She had participated in the assassination of a Gestapo officer who had been torturing resistance members. She had posed as a nurse, treating the officer for a minor ailment, had injected him with a fatal dose of potassium chloride that induced cardiac arrest, had calmly completed her examination before leaving while he died behind her. The woman who had once dreamed of saving lives in hospital operating rooms had been transformed by occupation and resistance into something harder, colder, capable of whatever actions the cause required. This transformation would make possible the audacious deception that became the Anna Keller operation. The idea for infiltrating Stalag 9C originated not with Marta, but with British intelligence operatives working with the Polish resistance. By late 1943, the Allies were receiving disturbing reports about conditions in German POW camps. While camps holding British and American prisoners were generally operated according to Geneva Convention standards, enforcement was inconsistent and opportunities for escape or rescue were extremely limited. British MI9, the military intelligence section responsible for escape and evasion, had been working with resistance networks across occupied Europe to establish escape lines for Allied prisoners. These networks, like the famous Comet Line through Belgium and France, had successfully evacuated hundreds of airmen and soldiers back to Allied territory. But the POW camps in central Germany presented unique challenges. They were far from neutral borders, surrounded by hostile territory, heavily guarded. Traditional escape methods, tunneling, wire cutting, impersonating guards, had low success rates and high casualty rates when they failed. A British intelligence officer working with the Polish resistance in late 1943 proposed a different approach. Rather than helping prisoners escape, what if they could be legally transported out of the camps under German authority, using the very bureaucracy of the Reich against itself? The idea focused on medical evacuations. Geneva Convention protocols required that seriously ill or wounded prisoners be transported to hospitals for treatment. Red Cross trucks regularly moved prisoners from camps to medical facilities. If someone could infiltrate the medical system, forge the necessary documentation, and coordinate with resistance networks along transport routes, prisoners could be evacuated under the guise of medical necessity. The plan required someone with medical knowledge sufficient to create convincing documentation, language skills to operate within German administrative systems, and a psychological fortitude to maintain a deep cover identity under constant scrutiny. The Polish resistance nominated Marta Kowalska. Creating the Anna Keller identity required months of meticulous preparation. Resistance forgers created a complete documentation package: birth certificate from Stuttgart, nursing certification from a hospital in Munich, employment records from military medical facilities, party membership papers, ration cards, personal letters from fictional family members. The backstory was carefully constructed. Anna Keller was the daughter of a German factory manager, educated in nursing during the mid-1930s, politically reliable but not fanatically Nazi, widowed when her husband was killed on the Eastern Front in 1941. She had volunteered for medical service in POW camps as her patriotic duty, bringing Germanic efficiency to the treatment of enemy prisoners. The character was designed to be simultaneously unremarkable and off-putting. She needed to be competent enough that her medical work wouldn't be questioned, but unpleasant enough that people wouldn't want to interact with her socially or examine her background too closely. A cruel, efficient nurse who did her job without warmth or mercy would be accepted without curiosity in the brutal context of wartime Germany. Marta spent weeks preparing for the role, studying nursing procedures she hadn't encountered in medical school, practicing the specific dialect of German spoken in Stuttgart, memorizing details of Anna Keller's fictional biography until they became automatic responses. She studied the psychology of cruelty, learning how to perform coldness and contempt in ways that would make both guards and prisoners avoid meaningful interaction with her. In December 1943, Anna Keller reported for duty at Stalag 9C. The camp commandant, Oberst Friedrich Weber, reviewed her papers with the cursory attention of a man processing dozens of administrative documents daily. Everything was in order. Another nurse to assist with the increasing medical needs of a camp population swollen with prisoners from the Italian and French campaigns. Marta walked through those gates carrying nothing but a small suitcase and the weight of an identity that could mean death if discovered. The nurse from hell had arrived. Stalag 9C in the winter of 1944 held approximately 4,000 Allied prisoners, primarily British and American soldiers captured during the fighting in Italy and France. The camp was divided into compounds by nationality, with separate barracks for officers and enlisted men, a common arrangement in German POW camps that complicated resistance organization but provided some structure to camp life. Conditions were harsh, but not deliberately murderous, at least not in the way concentration camps were designed for extermination. The Germans generally followed Geneva Convention protocols for Allied prisoners from Western nations. Adequate, if monotonous, food rations, basic medical care, correspondence privileges. Men survived, though malnutrition, disease, and the grinding psychological toll of indefinite imprisonment weakened them progressively. The camp infirmary where Marta worked was a long wooden building divided into examination rooms, a small surgery for minor procedures, and ward for patients requiring extended care. The medical staff consisted of a German doctor who visited twice weekly, 2 German nurses, including Marta, and several British medical officers who were themselves prisoners but allowed to practice medicine under German supervision. From her first days at Stalag 9C, Marta established the character of Anna Keller with calculated precision. She was cold during examinations, handling prisoners roughly, showing visible contempt for their complaints. She spoke to them in clipped, harsh German, making no effort to accommodate those who didn't understand the language. She reported malingering to the camp authorities, resulting in disciplinary action for prisoners she accused of faking illness to avoid work details. The German guards appreciated her efficiency and her apparent ideological reliability. She kept meticulous medical records, maintained the infirmary with obsessive cleanliness, and never fraternized with prisoners beyond medical necessity. Oberst Weber noted in his personnel files that Krankenschwester Keller was a model of German professionalism in difficult circumstances. The prisoners hated her. Within weeks, she had earned the nickname Nurse from Hell, whispered in barracks after lights out. Stories of her cruelty spread. She had slapped a British corporal who complained of chest pains. She had denied morphine to an American soldier with a broken leg. She had conducted examinations with deliberate roughness that bordered on abuse. British medical officer Captain James Mitchell, a physician from London who worked in the infirmary under German supervision, found her particularly insufferable. "She treats us like animals," he wrote in a diary he kept hidden in his bunk. "No compassion, no human decency, just cold efficiency and contempt. I've never encountered anyone so thoroughly lacking in the qualities that should define a medical professional." What Captain Mitchell and the other prisoners didn't know was that every act of cruelty was calculated. Every harsh word was performance. Marta was creating a character so thoroughly unpleasant that no one, neither guards nor prisoners, would want to examine her too closely, would want to spend time in her presence beyond absolute necessity. The performance served another crucial purpose. It provided cover for the real work that happened after dark, when the camp settled into uneasy sleep and the nurse from hell transformed into something else entirely. The infirmary office where Marta worked contained filing cabinets full of medical records for every prisoner in the camp. These documents tracked admissions, treatments, ongoing medical conditions, everything required for proper medical administration under Geneva Convention protocols. They were also the key to the entire escape operation. Each night, after the evening rounds were complete and the German guards had retired to their quarters, Marta would lock herself in the office with a single candle for light. Electric lights visible from outside would draw unwanted attention and begin the meticulous work of creating fictional medical crises. The process required extraordinary attention to detail. She couldn't simply forge documents wholesale. German bureaucracy was too sophisticated for that. Instead, she had to work within the existing system, manipulating real records to create justification for medical evacuations that would survive scrutiny from camp administrators and potentially from Gestapo investigators if suspicion arose. She would start by identifying prisoners who matched specific criteria. They needed to be fit enough to survive the escape journey, but not so healthy that their designation as critically ill would seem implausible. They needed to have existing medical records that could be plausibly developed into acute conditions requiring hospitalization. They needed to be soldiers whose absence from regular roll calls could be temporarily concealed through the manipulation of camp administrative records. British Sergeant Thomas Blackwood was typical of her selections. He had been treated in November for a respiratory infection that had since resolved. Marta went into his medical file and progressively documented a deterioration: persistent cough, difficulty breathing, suspected tuberculosis. She forged entries dated over several weeks, creating a medical narrative that built toward a crisis requiring immediate evacuation to a specialized facility. The forgeries were sophisticated, requiring medical knowledge that went far beyond simple document falsification. Marta had to understand disease progression, had to create symptom patterns that would convince any doctor who reviewed the records. She used her interrupted medical education, the years of study in Krakow, to construct convincing clinical pictures that justified emergency interventions. She also manipulated the prisoner identification system with extraordinary care. Each prisoner wore 2 metal tags, one to remain with the body if killed, one to be returned to camp administration if transported elsewhere. Marta would carefully swap tags between prisoners, creating administrative confusion that concealed the true identity of men being evacuated. A British sergeant's tags would go to an American private, whose tags would go to another British soldier, creating a chain of false identities that would take weeks to untangle if anyone bothered to investigate. The physical evacuations required coordination with resistance networks outside the camp. Red Cross trucks arrived regularly to transport genuinely sick prisoners to hospitals in Gotha and Erfurt. Marta had established contact with drivers who were resistance sympathizers, men who could be trusted to deviate from assigned routes, to deliver human cargo to safe houses rather than German medical facilities. The communication system was ingeniously simple. Marta would mark specific documents with nearly invisible notations: a pencil mark in a particular corner, a slightly irregular stamp placement that indicated to the driver which prisoners were destined for resistance networks rather than hospitals. The driver would acknowledge receipt with his own subtle signal, and the operation would proceed. Loading the trucks was the moment of greatest danger, the point where performance mattered most. Marta would supervise with her characteristic harsh efficiency, barking orders at prisoner orderlies who carried stretchers, checking paperwork with obsessive attention, creating a spectacle of Germanic thoroughness that discouraged questions or interference from guards. "Move faster, you lazy swine," she would shout in German, striking a stretcher with her clipboard for emphasis. "These men are dying because of your incompetence." The guards would watch with a mixture of amusement and discomfort, glad they weren't the targets of her wrath, uninterested in approaching close enough to become involved in her medical procedures. The prisoners being loaded would lie motionless on stretchers, genuinely frightened of this terrifying nurse, unaware they were being saved rather than transported to uncertain medical fate. Once the trucks departed the camp, the real evacuation began. The resistance drivers would take circuitous routes, claiming vehicle troubles if stopped, eventually reaching safe houses where the dying prisoners would be transferred to underground networks that moved them progressively westward toward Allied lines or neutral territory. The first successful evacuation occurred on January 15, 1944. 3 British soldiers, supposedly suffering from acute appendicitis, tuberculosis, and septic infection respectively, were loaded onto a Red Cross truck and driven out of Stalag 9C. By January 17th, they were in a safe house near Kassel. By January 25th, they had reached contacts near the Swiss border. By February 3rd, they were in Allied hands, debriefed by intelligence officers who could barely believe the story of the cruel German nurse who had orchestrated their escape. The success of that first operation validated the entire approach. Over the following weeks, Marta increased the pace of evacuations, refining her techniques, growing bolder as confidence built. By the end of January, she had evacuated 15 prisoners. By mid-February, the number exceeded 50. But increasing success brought increasing risk. Each evacuation created administrative anomalies that might eventually draw attention. Each forged document was another potential point of failure. Each prisoner who reached Allied lines was another person who knew details of the operation, another potential security breach, if captured and interrogated. Marta knew the operation had a limited lifespan. The question was how many lives she could save before the inevitable collapse. The prisoners themselves remained completely unaware of what was happening. They saw the nurse from hell load sick men onto trucks, watch them disappear toward hospitals, assumed they were receiving treatment or perhaps dying in German medical facilities. None suspected that evacuation by this cruel woman was actually salvation. Captain James Mitchell, the British medical officer, actually protested some of Marta's medical decisions. That man doesn't need hospitalization, he argued in early February when she designated a British corporal for evacuation. His condition is stable. You're wasting resources. Marta turned on him with calculated fury. You question my medical judgment, Captain? Perhaps you'd like to explain to the Commandant why British prisoners are receiving inadequate care? I could arrange that conversation. Mitchell backed down, frustrated and angry, convinced this German nurse was either incompetent or deliberately cruel. He had no idea he was watching a rescue operation unfold before his eyes. The deception extended to the prisoners being evacuated. Marta couldn't risk telling them the truth. If they knew they were being rescued, their behavior might change in ways that would alert guards. Fear of the cruel nurse loading them onto trucks kept them passive and compliant, making the evacuations proceed smoothly. Only after the trucks left camp property, after the drivers deviated from official routes and arrived at resistance safe houses, would the prisoners learn the truth. The revelation was often met with stunned disbelief. The nurse from hell, who had terrified them, who had seemed to embody German cruelty, had been saving their lives at extraordinary personal risk. Sergeant Thomas Blackwood, one of the early evacuees, later wrote about the moment of realization. We arrived at a farmhouse near Kassel, expecting German doctors. Instead, Polish resistance fighters pulled us from the truck and told us we were free. When they explained about the nurse, about who she really was, I couldn't process it. That monster who'd handled me so roughly, who'd shown such contempt, she'd been saving us all along. I wept with shame for having hated her. By early March 1944, Marta had evacuated more than 200 prisoners. The operation was running with extraordinary efficiency, each evacuation building on lessons learned from previous operations. She had refined her forgery techniques to the point where documents would survive detailed scrutiny. She had established backup communication channels with resistance networks in case primary contacts were compromised. She had even begun coordinating with other camps, sharing techniques with resistance operatives attempting similar operations elsewhere. But success carried the seeds of its own destruction. The Gestapo, German military intelligence, and camp administrative officers were not fools. Patterns eventually emerged that would draw attention no matter how careful the deception. The first hint of trouble came in early March when a Wehrmacht administrative officer in Erfurt noticed statistical anomalies in medical transport records. The hospital in Erfurt was receiving fewer critically ill prisoners from Stalag 9C than documentation suggested should be arriving. Where were these missing patients? The officer initiated a routine inquiry, requesting transport logs and patient admission records from multiple facilities. The discrepancies were small enough to be attributed to bureaucratic errors, but they existed. Someone was paying attention. Simultaneously, British intelligence was becoming concerned from the opposite direction. The successful evacuations had resulted in dozens of former POWs reaching Allied lines with stories of a German nurse who had orchestrated their escape. MI9 officers debriefing these men recognized the security implications immediately. Too many people now knew details of the operation. If any of these former prisoners were recaptured by German forces and interrogated, a real possibility given the fluid front lines in Italy, They might reveal information that would compromise the operation and identify Marta. British intelligence sent urgent messages through resistance networks. The operation needed to shut down immediately before German security services connected the various threads of evidence. Marta received these warnings in mid-March through her resistance contacts. She faced an agonizing decision. She could cease evacuations immediately, destroying records and disappearing into the underground networks that had created Anna Keller. This would be safest, would maximize her chances of survival. But hundreds of prisoners remained in Stalag 9C, men who could potentially be saved if the operation continued just a few more weeks. Marta chose to continue. She knew the risks, understood that each additional day increased the probability of discovery. But she also understood that every prisoner evacuated was a life saved, a family that would be whole when the war ended, a future that would exist instead of being extinguished in captivity. She accelerated the pace of evacuations, taking risks she had previously avoided, pushing the limits of plausibility in her medical documentation. In the last week of March alone, she evacuated 43 prisoners, an extraordinarily dangerous spike in activity that could not help but draw attention. The end came not from the statistical analysis in Erfurt or from British intelligence concerns, but from simple human betrayal. On March 28, 1944, Gestapo officers in Kassel arrested a resistance courier during a routine security sweep. Under interrogation, torture, more accurately, the courier revealed details of the safe house network that received prisoners from Stalag 9C. The Gestapo moved with characteristic efficiency. By March 30th, they had raided 3 safe houses, arrested 15 resistance members, and captured documents that referenced a medical evacuation operation at a POW camp. They didn't yet know which camp or who was running the operation, but they knew enough to be extremely dangerous. Marta received warning through her resistance contacts on the evening of March 30th. The network was compromised. Gestapo was investigating. She needed to disappear immediately. She spent that night destroying evidence, burning forged documents, removing the subtle marks she had placed on official records that indicated prisoners for evacuation. She worked through the darkness, erasing as much of Anna Keller's secret activities as possible, trying to protect the men she hadn't yet managed to evacuate. At dawn on March 31st, she walked through the gates of Stalag 9C for the last time. She carried only a small bag, wearing her nurse's uniform, looking like she was beginning another ordinary day of work. The guards nodded to her with their usual disinterested recognition. In the infirmary, she conducted morning rounds with her characteristic harsh efficiency. Captain Mitchell noted in his diary that she seemed particularly severe that day, more cutting in her remarks, rougher in her examinations. He assumed she was having a bad day, never imagining he was watching a performance designed to maintain character even in the final hours. At midday, Marta retreated to the infirmary office, claiming she needed to complete paperwork. She locked the door, removed her nurse's cap, and placed it carefully on the desk along with her German identification papers. In their place, she extracted documents hidden in a secret compartment of her medical bag, new identity papers, travel permits, everything needed to transform from Anna Keller into someone else entirely. She changed into civilian clothes she had smuggled into the office over previous weeks, piece by piece, hidden among medical supplies. The transformation took less than 10 minutes. Anna Keller disappeared, replaced by Maria Schneider, a factory worker traveling to visit family in Frankfurt. The exit from camp was almost anticlimactic. She simply walked out during the afternoon shift change when multiple people moved through the gates: delivery drivers, administrative staff, visiting officials. In the chaos of normal camp operations, one woman leaving drew no attention. By evening, Marta was on a train heading west, traveling on forged papers, her nurse's cap left behind as the only physical evidence of Anna Keller's existence. The cap was stained with blood, not from cruelty, but from the legitimate medical work she had performed alongside the covert evacuations, evidence of the dual reality she had inhabited for 3 months. The Gestapo arrived at Stalag 9C on April 2, 1944. They interrogated Oberstweber, examined medical records, questioned guards and prisoners. They found the abandoned nurse's cap, the documentation that seemed impeccably in order, and absolutely no trace of the woman who had worn it. Anna Keller had simply vanished. Investigation of her background revealed that while all the documentation appeared authentic, none of it could be independently verified. The hospital in Munich that supposedly certified her had no record of her training. The address in Stuttgart where she claimed to have been born was a building destroyed in an Allied bombing raid in 1942, all records lost. The Gestapo realized they had been chasing a ghost. Anna Keller was a fiction, a character performed so convincingly that everyone had accepted her reality without question. Who she really was, where she had gone, remained mysteries that Gestapo investigations never successfully solved. The aftermath of the operation unfolded over subsequent weeks and months. The Gestapo arrested several resistance members connected to the Safe House network, though most key operatives had been warned and disappeared before capture. The Red Cross drivers who had cooperated were identified and arrested, though they revealed nothing under interrogation beyond the fact that they had been following instructions from someone they knew only as the nurse. At Stalag 9C, the prisoners gradually learned what had happened. The realization spread through whispered conversations. The cruel nurse who had terrified them had been saving lives. The terminally ill, men who had been evacuated had not died in German hospitals, but had reached freedom through underground networks. Captain Mitchell, learning the truth, experienced a profound transformation of understanding. "I thought I was witnessing cruelty," he wrote in his diary in April. "I was actually witnessing one of the most extraordinary acts of courage I've ever encountered. That woman risked everything, death, torture, to save men she couldn't even tell she was helping. The hatred we felt for her was proof of her success. I will carry the shame and gratitude of that realization for the rest of my life." The British and American military authorities, debriefing the more than 300 prisoners who had reached Allied lines through the operation, recognized the achievement. This was one of the most successful POW rescue operations of the entire war, executed not through violent escape attempts, but through the manipulation of German bureaucracy by a woman operating completely alone behind enemy lines. But publicly acknowledging the operation was impossible during the war. Doing so would endanger other similar operations and make the Germans more vigilant about medical evacuations. So the story remained classified, known only to intelligence services and the men whose lives had been saved. Marta Kowalska herself disappeared into the underground networks of occupied Europe. There are fragmentary records of her continued resistance activities. A woman matching her description appears in several operations over the following year, always under different identities, always involved in dangerous missions that required medical knowledge and extraordinary courage. The most reliable accounts place her in Warsaw during the uprising of August 1944, working as a combat medic treating wounded resistance fighters. Other reports suggest she was involved in operations smuggling Jewish children out of Poland into Hungary, using forged medical documents to transport them as patients requiring specialized care. What is certain is that Marta survived the war. In 1945, she returned to Krakow and attempted to resume the medical education that had been interrupted 6 years earlier. But the Jagiellonian University, physically intact but intellectually devastated by German occupation, was a shadow of its former self. Many of its professors were dead, killed in concentration camps or resistance operations. Marta completed her medical degree in 1947 and began practicing medicine in Krakow, specializing in pediatrics rather than the emergency medicine she had once pursued. Colleagues who worked with her in the post-war years describe a woman who was intensely private, who spoke rarely of her wartime experiences, who seemed to carry memories that were too heavy for casual conversation. She never married, devoted herself entirely to her medical practice, and became known in Krakow as an exceptionally compassionate physician who showed particular attention to the most vulnerable patients, orphans, children from impoverished families, anyone who reminded her perhaps of the men she had saved when they were most helpless. The communist authorities who controlled Poland after the war were ambiguous about resistance heroes whose operations had been coordinated with Western intelligence services. Marta received no official recognition for her wartime activities, no medals or public acknowledgement. The Anna Keller operation remained classified in both British and Polish files, a secret that outlived the war it had served. But the men who had been saved never forgot. Over the years following the war's end, former prisoners who had been evacuated from Stalag 9C attempted to find the woman who had saved them. They knew her only as the cruel German nurse, whose real name and fate remained unknown to them during their captivity. In 1962, a British veterans organization finally succeeded in identifying Marta Kowalska as the woman behind the Anna Keller identity. They contacted her in Krakow, requesting permission to publicly acknowledge her wartime service. Marta refused, insisting that she had simply done what needed to be done, that recognition was unnecessary and unwanted. "The men who survived don't need to thank me," she wrote in response to their request. "They survived. That is enough. Let the past remain in the past." But the veterans persisted. In 1965, 15 former prisoners from Stalag 9C traveled to Krakow to meet the woman who had saved them. The reunion was private, held in Marta's small apartment, away from media attention or public ceremony. Thomas Blackwood, by then a teacher in Yorkshire, was among them. He later described the meeting. "We arrived expecting someone larger than life, a hero from a story. Instead, we found a quiet woman in her 50s, a doctor who seemed more interested in asking about our lives and families than discussing her wartime activities. When we tried to thank her, she became uncomfortable, insisted we not make too much of what she had done. But her eyes, when she looked at us, I saw something there. Relief, perhaps, that we had survived and built lives. Satisfaction that her risks had meant something. She hugged each of us before we left, the only time she showed any emotion. It was the embrace of someone who had carried us in her thoughts for 20 years, wondering if we had survived." Marta Kowalska died in 1989, just months before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the communist system in Poland. She was 73, had practiced medicine for over 4 decades, had touched thousands of lives through her medical work in peacetime. Her death brought renewed attention to her wartime service. With the end of the Cold War and the declassification of many wartime intelligence files, the full story of the Anna Keller operation could finally be told publicly. British, American, and Polish authorities acknowledged what they had been unable to recognize during her lifetime, that she had executed one of the most successful rescue operations of World War II. In 1991, Marta was posthumously awarded the Cross of Valor by the Polish government, recognizing her resistance service. The British government issued a formal commendation acknowledging her role in saving British lives. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, recognizing that her techniques for creating false identities and smuggling people through German bureaucracy had been used to save Jewish lives as well as Allied prisoners, included her story in their archives. But perhaps the most meaningful memorial came from the veterans themselves. Former prisoners who had been evacuated from Stalag 9C established a scholarship at the Jagiellonian University Medical School in Marta's name, supporting students who demonstrated not only academic excellence, but also moral courage and commitment to humanitarian service. The scholarship continues to this day, ensuring that each generation of medical students learns the story of a woman who used medicine not just to heal, but to resist tyranny and save lives through extraordinary deception. The psychological complexity of what Marta accomplished deserves deeper examination. She had to maintain a split identity so complete that neither persona contaminated the other. During the day, she was Anna Keller, cruel, efficient, without compassion. She had to strike prisoners, deny them comfort, treat them with contempt convincing enough to make everyone believe in her cruelty. But at night, alone in the infirmary office with her forged documents and careful plans, she became Marta Kowalska again, the woman who had dedicated her life to healing, who risked everything to save men she would never see again, who carried the weight of knowing that each prisoner she couldn't evacuate might die in captivity. The psychological toll of this sustained deception must have been extraordinary. Modern understanding of deep cover operations suggests that maintaining dual identities for extended periods creates profound psychological stress. Operatives report feeling disconnected from their true selves, uncertain which version of themselves is real, struggling with the moral weight of actions taken while in character. Marta never spoke publicly about this aspect of her experience, but colleagues in her post-war medical practice noted certain behaviors that suggested lasting impact. She was intensely uncomfortable with any form of deception in her professional life, insisting on complete honesty with patients even when gentle lies might have been kinder. She avoided situations where she might need to pretend or perform, preferring solitary work to social situations that required adopting any persona other than her authentic self. Dr. Anna Keller, who worked alongside Marta in Krakow in the 1950s, recalled, "She once told me that she could no longer watch theatrical performances. The sight of actors pretending to be someone else, even in innocent entertainment, caused her profound discomfort." She said she had used up her lifetime capacity for deception in 3 months during the war and couldn't bear even harmless pretense anymore. The moral complexity of the operation extends beyond the personal psychological toll. Marta's success depended on making prisoners genuinely fear and hate her. The men she was saving experienced real psychological suffering from what they perceived as her cruelty. She inflicted emotional harm, even if in service of physical salvation, on people who were already traumatized by captivity. Some of the prisoners who were never evacuated, who remained in Stalag 9C until liberation by Allied forces in 1945, carried bitter memories of the nurse from hell for the rest of their lives. They never learned the truth, never discovered that her cruelty had been performance. For them, Anna Keller remained a genuine example of German brutality, a symbol of their suffering. When the full story became public in the 1960s, some of these men struggled to reconcile their memories with the reality. One former prisoner, who had been struck by Marta during a medical examination and carried resentment for decades, wrote to her after learning the truth, "I don't know how to feel. For 20 years, I hated you. The memory of your cruelty sustained my anger, gave me something concrete to blame for my suffering. Now I learn it was all deception, all necessary. But the emotional harm was real. The fear was real. Can I forgive cruelty that was calculated for good purposes? Should I? I honestly don't know." Marta reportedly never responded to that letter. Perhaps she had no answer, or perhaps she understood that some moral complexities admit no resolution, only acknowledgement. The technical aspects of the operation reveal just how sophisticated resistance networks had become by 1944. The creation of the Anna Keller identity required resources far beyond simple document forgery. Resistance organizations had developed the capability to create complete false identities that could survive bureaucratic scrutiny in one of the most administratively rigorous states in history. The documents themselves were masterpieces of forgery. Paper had to be correctly aged, acquired from appropriate sources. Resistance members stole blank forms from German administrative offices, providing authentic paper stock with correct watermarks and official markings. Typewriters used for forms had to match the specific models used by German bureaucracies in the relevant time periods and locations. Signatures were practiced until forgers could reproduce the distinctive handwriting of German officials who might have signed Anna Keller's documents. Stamps were carved to precisely match official seals, using photographs of authentic documents as references. Even the ink had to be correct. German bureaucratic standards specified particular ink formulations for official documents, and forgers had to match these specifications to avoid detection under examination. Beyond the documents themselves, the resistance had to create a shadow presence for Anna Keller in German administrative systems. False entries were inserted into hospital employment records through sympathetic workers. Retroactive documentation was created showing her presence at locations she had never visited. The entire apparatus of a person's existence had to be constructed in such detail that anyone investigating her background would find corroborating evidence at every turn. This level of sophistication required networks that extended throughout German-occupied territory and into Germany itself. Polish resistance worked with German anti-Nazi networks, with French intelligence services, with British special operations, creating a web of cooperation that could support operations like the Anna Keller deception. The operation also demonstrated the effectiveness of exploiting bureaucratic systems against themselves. The German administrative state, with its obsession with proper documentation and procedural correctness, created vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Officials confronted with seemingly correct paperwork would rarely investigate further. The appearance of bureaucratic propriety was often sufficient. Marta understood this instinctively. Her medical documentation was always impeccably formatted, properly stamped, filed in correct sequence. She exploited the German faith in bureaucratic order, understanding that officials would trust the system more than they would trust their own observations. A properly documented medical emergency would be accepted even if the patient being evacuated didn't appear critically ill, because the paperwork said he was, and the paperwork was always correct. This principle, that authoritarian systems create exploitable vulnerabilities through their own rigidity, would influence resistance operations for decades afterward. Intelligence services studied the Anna Keller operation as a case study in bureaucratic exploitation, applying its lessons to Cold War operations and beyond. The broader impact of the operation on POW rescue efforts deserves recognition. While Marta's work at Stalag 9C was uniquely successful, it was part of a larger pattern of resistance efforts to evacuate Allied prisoners. Similar operations were attempted at other camps with varying degrees of success. The techniques Marta developed, forged medical documentation, exploitation of Red Cross transport protocols, coordination with resistance networks along transport routes, were shared through intelligence channels and attempted elsewhere. Not all succeeded. Some were discovered before significant numbers of prisoners could be evacuated, resulting in executions of resistance members and increased security at camps. But collectively, these efforts evacuated thousands of Allied prisoners over the course of the war, significantly more than escaped through traditional methods like tunneling or wire cutting. The bureaucratic approach to escape, using the enemy's own systems against them, proved remarkably effective when executed properly. The Geneva Convention protocols that required medical care for POW prisoners, intended as humanitarian protections, became tools of resistance. The Red Cross vehicles meant to transport the sick became vehicles of liberation. The very humanity that civilized nations had codified into international law was turned into a weapon against those who would have cynically exploited it. The strategic impact extended beyond the individuals saved. Each successful evacuation represented an intelligence windfall for the Allies. Prisoners reaching Allied lines brought current information about German dispositions, morale, industrial production, military capabilities. They provided eyewitness accounts of conditions in occupied territory, information about resistance networks, details that informed Allied strategic planning. The prisoners evacuated by Marta brought specific intelligence about German operations in central Germany, troop movements they had observed, conversations they had overheard between guards, details about German military logistics and supply systems. This information, aggregated across hundreds of debriefings, contributed to Allied understanding of German capabilities during the crucial period leading up to D-Day and the subsequent campaigns across Western Europe. The personal stories of individual prisoners saved through the operation illuminate the human dimension of Marta's achievement. Each of the 300-plus men evacuated had a story, a life that would have been different or ended without her intervention. Corporal David Warren, an American soldier from Iowa, had been captured in Italy in November 1943. By March 1944, he was suffering from severe malnutrition and recurring infections, his health deteriorating in the harsh conditions of Stalag 9C. Marta identified him for evacuation, forged documentation indicating advanced pneumonia, and loaded him onto a transport in mid-March. Warren reached Allied lines in April, recovered in a British hospital, and eventually returned to Iowa after the war. He became a teacher, married, raised 4 children. In 1967, when the Anna Keller story became public, Warren calculated that Marta's intervention had made possible not just his own continued existence, but the lives of his children and eventually 13 grandchildren, an entire branch of humanity that existed because a Polish woman risked her life to save a stranger. "I never knew her," Warren said in an interview years later. "She loaded me onto that truck while I was barely conscious with what I thought was genuine illness. I never spoke to her, never learned her real name until decades afterward. But everything I have, my life, my family, every moment of joy I've experienced, exists because of her courage." How do you process a debt like that? How do you thank someone for literally everything? Lieutenant Robert Hamilton, a British officer, had a different experience. He was among the prisoners who had suffered under what he believed was Anna Keller's genuine cruelty. She had struck him during an examination, denied him medical care he believed he needed, treated him with contempt that left psychological scars. When Hamilton was evacuated in late February, part of a group Marta had designated as suffering from suspected typhus, he was relieved to escape the nurse from hell, even if it meant potentially dying in a German hospital. His journey to freedom, his eventual return to Britain, brought joy tempered by bitter memories of his treatment at Stalag 9C. Learning the truth in 1965 created a crisis of understanding. "My anger had been righteous," he later wrote. "I had been genuinely mistreated by this woman, or so I believed. Learning it was performance, that she was saving me while making me hate her, didn't erase the emotional harm. It complicated it. I went from having a clear villain in my memory to having a savior whose methods of salvation involved genuine cruelty. I still don't know how I feel about it. Grateful, certainly, but also confused about the ethics of causing psychological harm for beneficial purposes." The question Hamilton raised, whether calculated cruelty in service of salvation can be morally justified, has no simple answer. Marta herself seems to have struggled with it. In one of her rare comments about the operation, made to a close colleague in the 1970s, she acknowledged the moral weight. "I hurt people to save them. I made them fear me, hate me, suffer emotional anguish while I was actually working to free them. Was I right to do this? I believed so at the time. I still believe the outcome justified the methods. But I carry the weight of that harm nonetheless. It was necessary, but necessary evils are still evil in their execution, even if righteous in their purpose." The intersection of the Anna Keller operation with the broader Holocaust rescue efforts adds another dimension to Marta's story. While the primary mission was evacuating Allied POWs, Marta also used her position and techniques to assist in smuggling Jewish prisoners and refugees to safety. Stalag 9C, like most POW camps, occasionally held Jewish prisoners, though they were typically segregated and treated more harshly than other Allied captives. Marta identified several Jewish prisoners during her time at the camp and prioritized them for evacuation when possible, understanding they faced not just imprisonment, but potential transfer to extermination camps. Additionally, her techniques for creating false identities and exploiting medical transport systems were shared with networks specifically focused on rescuing Jews from occupied Poland and Germany. The same basic approach, forged medical documentation, false identities, exploitation of bureaucratic systems, could be applied to smuggling Jewish children or adults out of ghettos and occupied territories. There are documented cases of Marta personally creating false medical documentation for Jewish families in Krakow before her assignment to Stalag 9C, and evidence suggests she continued advising on such operations even while maintaining her Anna Keller identity. The networks intersected with resistance members working on multiple types of rescue operations simultaneously. This aspect of her work remained largely unknown until researchers in the 1990s began systematically examining the connections between different resistance operations. What emerged was a picture of extraordinary versatility. Marta wasn't just the nurse from hell saving Allied soldiers. She was a crucial node in multiple rescue networks, applying her skills wherever they could save lives regardless of the specific population at risk. The technical evolution of her forgery skills reveals continuous improvement under pressure. Early documents she created in 1943, examined post-war, show competent but not perfect technique. Later forgeries from early 1944, created during the Anna Keller operation, are virtually indistinguishable from authentic documents even under expert examination. This improvement came from bitter experience. Every close call, every moment when documents came under scrutiny, taught lessons that were incorporated into subsequent forgeries. Resistance networks shared information about German security procedures, about new authentication methods being implemented, about bureaucratic changes that required corresponding changes in forged documents. Marta maintained a mental database of these evolving requirements, constantly updating her techniques. She learned that certain German officials had distinctive signature styles that needed precise replication. She discovered that documents from specific time periods required particular rubber stamp formulations that had changed during the war due to material shortages. She mastered the subtle differences between documents produced in different regions of Germany, ensuring her forgeries matched the supposed geographic origins of Anna Keller's background. This obsessive attention to detail, this continuous refinement of technique, was what kept her alive and kept the operation running when less careful approaches would have resulted in discovery and execution. The final weeks of the operation, as Marta accelerated evacuations despite knowing discovery was increasingly likely, showed extraordinary courage bordering on recklessness. She was aware through resistance networks that German security services were closing in, that the safe houses were compromised, that each additional day increased the probability of her capture and execution. Yet she continued, evacuating prisoners at an unsustainable pace, taking risks that defied the careful protocols that had protected her for months. In those final weeks, she evacuated more than 80 prisoners, nearly a quarter of her total success compressed into a period when operational security was most compromised. Her motivations during this period have been debated by historians. Some suggest she was driven by determination to save as many lives as possible before the inevitable end. Others propose she was seeking a form of redemption, trying to compensate for the cruelty she had performed even in service of salvation. Still others believe she simply couldn't stop, that the operation had become so central to her identity that ending it voluntarily was psychologically impossible. What is certain is that she saved dozens of additional lives during those final desperate weeks, lives that would have been lost if she had chosen the safer path of early extraction. The men evacuated in late March 1944, some of whom would have died in captivity before the war's end, owed their survival to her decision to continue despite the risks. Her escape from Stalag 9C on March 30 first demonstrated the same meticulous planning that had characterized the entire operation. She had prepared multiple extraction scenarios, with contingency plans for different threat levels. The final exit, walking out during shift change with false papers, was actually her third-tier plan, used only when more elaborate extraction methods became too dangerous. The journey from Stalag 9C to safety took her through a landscape that was itself dangerous and chaotic. By early 1944, Allied bombing had disrupted German transportation networks, making travel unpredictable. Security checks were frequent, document inspections thorough. Yet Marta navigated this gauntlet successfully, her false identity as Maria Schneider surviving multiple inspections. She reached Warsaw in mid-April 1944, reconnecting with resistance networks there just as planning was beginning for what would become the Warsaw Uprising. Her medical skills were desperately needed, and she immediately volunteered for medical service supporting resistance fighters. The Warsaw Uprising, which began on August 1, 1944, was one of the most tragic episodes of the war. Polish resistance forces attempted to liberate Warsaw before Soviet forces arrived, hoping to establish Polish sovereignty before communist control could be imposed. The uprising lasted 63 days, resulted in approximately 200,000 Polish deaths, and ended with German forces systematically destroying the city. Marta worked as a combat medic throughout the uprising, treating wounded fighters in improvised hospitals established in sewers, basements, and ruins. Survivors of the uprising recalled a doctor who worked with tireless intensity, who seemed to carry some deeper mission beyond immediate medical care, who saved lives with skills that seemed almost supernatural in the horrific conditions of urban combat. One resistance fighter, Anna Kowalska, no relation to Marta, later described her work. "The Germans were killing us systematically, destroying our city block by block. We had almost no medical supplies, no proper facilities. But this doctor, we knew her only as Maria, performed miracles. She operated in cellars by candlelight, amputated limbs with improvised tools, kept men alive who should have died. She never spoke about her past, but we knew she had done this before, had worked under impossible conditions, and saved lives despite everything." Marta survived the Warsaw Uprising, escaping through the sewers when the final collapse came in October 1944. She made her way back to Krakow, arriving in a city that had survived occupation relatively intact, but was now facing an uncertain future as Soviet forces approached from the east. The transition from war to peace was psychologically difficult for many resistance fighters, and Marta was no exception. The skills that had made her invaluable during the war, deception, forged documents, operating under false identities, had no place in peacetime. The intensity of resistance work, the constant danger and moral clarity of fighting against occupation, gave way to the mundane complexities of rebuilding shattered societies. Marta's return to medical education in 1945 represented an attempt to reclaim the future that had been stolen in 1939. But she was no longer the idealistic student who had entered medical school 6 years earlier. She had killed, had forged documents that violated every law, had deceived with consummate skill, had hurt people even while saving them. Her professors at the reopened Jagiellonian University, those who had survived the war, noticed the change. She was technically brilliant, her practical skills far beyond what any medical student should possess. But she was also distant, emotionally controlled in ways that suggested profound psychological barriers. Dr. Tadeusz Nowicki, who taught surgery, observed she could perform procedures that should have been beyond a student's capabilities. When I asked how she had learned these techniques, she would simply say she had practice during the war. But there was a cost to that knowledge. She approached medicine with an intensity that suggested she was trying to compensate for something, trying to heal enough people to balance some equation only she understood. The choice to specialize in pediatrics rather than her pre-war interest in emergency medicine seemed deliberate. Children represented innocence, futures that could be protected. They were patients who hadn't yet been shaped by the moral compromises and brutal necessities of the adult world. Perhaps in treating children, Marta found a form of medicine that felt pure, uncomplicated by the deceptions and moral ambiguities that had defined her wartime service. Her practice in Krakow became renowned for both clinical excellence and extraordinary compassion. She would see patients at any hour, never refuse care based on ability to pay, and showed particular attention to the most vulnerable children in Polish society. Orphans whose parents had died in the war, children from impoverished families, Roma children who faced discrimination. Colleagues noticed she kept photographs in her office, though she never explained their significance. After her death, these were discovered to be pictures of some of the prisoners she had evacuated from Stalag 9C. Photographs sent by grateful men who had wanted her to see their families, their children, the future she had made possible. Marta Kowalska lived quietly in Krakow for 44 years after the war, treating children, avoiding recognition, carrying memories too complex for easy processing. She witnessed Poland's transformation from Nazi occupation to communist control to the eventual freedom that came in 1989, just months before her death. Her legacy extends beyond the specific lives she saved. The Anna Keller operation demonstrated that resistance could take forms beyond armed combat, that intelligence and deception could be as effective as weapons, that a single individual with courage and skill could accomplish what seemed impossible. The men and women who study intelligence operations, who train for resistance work, who prepare for scenarios where ordinary people must become extraordinary, All of them learn about the nurse from hell, who saved 300 lives through performance and forgery. Her story reminds us that heroism sometimes requires becoming what we most despise, that salvation can wear the face of cruelty, that the most profound acts of compassion may never be recognized by those they save. The prisoners who hated Anna Keller were saved by Marta Kowalska, and that paradox, the necessity of being hated to accomplish good, represents one of war's most profound moral complexities. In the end, Marta Kowalska was a healer who understood that sometimes healing requires deception, a humanitarian who knew that saving lives might demand causing suffering, a woman of profound compassion who could perform perfect cruelty when necessity demanded. She lived with the weight of these contradictions, carried them through decades of peacetime practice, and took to her grave the full emotional cost of what she had accomplished. They called her the nurse from hell. They should have called her what she truly was, a woman who descended into hell, wore its mask perfectly, and brought 300 souls back to the light.